Joseph and the Coat of Many Colors. I think because the first part of it, it was sad that they did what they did do to him, and then at the end, how he had forgiven them all and made sure they had enough food to eat.
I would say my favorite Bible story would be Moses. The fact that he was hidden and wasn't killed with everybody else, and that he ended up leading the Israelites through the desert. He saw God, and the burning bush. There's just so much history with him.
Well, one of my favorite Bible stories is the story of Ruth. I love the fact that she left her home and went with her mother-in-law to a land she'd never really known to worship a God who I presume Naomi demonstrated to her, but she hadn't grown up in that culture and that kind of thing. I really like the character of Boaz, mostly because he shows how he was a God-fearing man in a land who, while they ostensibly honored God, didn't really honor God. He had to tell his workers not to harass Ruth when she came to harvest, to pick up the leavings that they left behind when they were harvesting, which tells me that it was necessary for him to say that. And that he did it is another incredible thing. And in fact, he told them to pull her out. So he was a generous man. He's like, I want to take care of these people who don't have outs.
I like the story of Hannah, who continued to pray for a child and who endured the animosity of her husband's other wife. And when she was given Samuel, she returned him to the temple.
I like the story of David and Goliath because it tells of somebody who was small in stature but accomplished great things.
So Elijah comes to her looking for a meal, but she only has enough oil and flour to feed her and her son. And he tells her to have faith, and so she makes the meal, and she has enough oil and flour to last her until the famine is over.
I like the story of Daniel because it showed how they just picked him out, like he stood out from every other person. I like the fact that he didn't join other people, like he didn't join them to eat the king's food, and yet he ended up being much better than the rest of them. And I like that he stood by his principles, stood by God, even when they told him to worship other gods.
I really enjoy Rack, Shack, and Benny.
My favorite Bible study was the Christmas story. Probably as a small child, it was because I associated with Christmas. But as an adult, I really understand the importance of the Christmas story.
So my favorite Bible story is just a snippet when Jesus was teaching. Families were bringing their children to listen to Jesus, and the disciples were trying to shoo them away, but Jesus said, no, let the children come. And that's my favorite story because it really shows that everybody's a part of this story, and that you can teach children, and they're really the next generation to come up and help to grow the kingdom of God. So that was my favorite story.
The prodigal son, and it's not necessarily for the content. I do like the story of the son that's gone and ends up coming back to his father, and his father accepts him back in. But growing up as a child, I always read that as this is how we should treat other Christians and family members that stray from the way of Christ, is bring them back in, love them, welcome them. And since I started going to Timothy group, I realized that it's actually even more than that. And when I was in Rwanda as well, I realized it was more than that. It's the story of Jesus welcoming us back into his family. And I think it epitomizes all of Jesus's parables so well to me. It's like it's got so many different meanings, and you can read it in so many different ways, and it's just one of my favorite stories for many reasons.
My favorite Bible story, or one of them, I think, is as a child, fishers of men and Jesus walking on the water, because that was, for a child, such a miracle and almost unbelievable. And it keeps reoccurring in different places. For example, we were in New Zealand many years ago, and we were in a Maori reservation, and the church there, when you sat down, the stained glass window at the front of the church was Jesus, who looked like he was walking, and when you sat in the pew, he was walking on the water. That was behind the church. And it was unbelievable.
And it reminds me of the story where Jesus says the kingdom of God is like yeast. And yeast it's not impressive looking, has no real power, but it quietly and invisibly works its way through the whole dough, and when the yeast is done, the dough is changed. And I just find that an encouraging story, because sometimes we find things, we're not high profile as the church, and we always push to the side, but the kingdom of God still does his work. And the yeast is working its way through the dough, and that's great.
Jesus praying in Gethsemane. Because there have been times in my life when I've had nowhere else to go except to God, and knowing that Jesus had to do that as well is comforting. I haven't sweat drops of blood, but the things that we bear as the things that we think are stressful, when I think of this particular moment, would pale in comparison to what he had on his shoulders. So it gives me encouragement to think about that.
The resurrection, I like that one the best, the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus.
Okay.
It's a real powerful story.
Yeah.
For some reason, the last part of the book of 2 Timothy really speaks to me, and it's where Paul is facing the end of his life, and he just starts talking about all these things that he wants Timothy and his friends to bring him, like his scrolls and his parchments and his cloak. I mean, such simple little things that just make him seem so human to me. I always, as a kid, hearing about Paul, I always thought of him as this superhuman guy that was just so Christ-filled and did so much for the church that he couldn't possibly be real. But as an older person, I started reading more about Timothy and about the end of his days, and he just became more real and human to me, because he was cold, he was in a dungeon, he was about to die, and he was just reaching out to his friends because he was lonely, and he wanted the things that gave him comfort and in the end. And that just, every time I read that, I almost start to tear up, because it just, he was a real guy, and he was human, and he had the same hopes and fears that we all do. And I thank God that he made that part of the Bible that we could read about, and to think that, yes, he did all these amazing things, but he was just like one of us, and so we can do amazing things like that too.
My favorite Bible story is the end of Revelation and the new city, the new Jerusalem, when all believers are with God again.